Hey, Dr. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to meet you, Laurie.
I'm so happy to invite you onto the podcast because we're going to talk about the brain today. We're going to talk about the brain at work. But before we get started with all of that, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you're all about?
I am an assistant professor at Utah Tech University. Um, I teach psychology and I research about psychology. Um, I am also a psychotherapist and a business consultant. So kind of a range of things, and I love all of it.
Wow. Well, you've got a bit of a portfolio career, as we like to say in the career advice business. You do a little bit of everything.
Mhm.
Why do you do what you do?
Um, oh wow. Well, specific to autism, I kind of just stumbled upon it. Um, I have autistic folks in my family and grew up around it before we even had the label of autism. Um, so I think that it was a familiar way of showing up, even before I realized that I really loved professionally working with autistic folks.
Well, I love that we're right out the gate with the word autism because in the world of work right now, there are many people who are identifying as autistic or neurodivergent. And I thought maybe we can get like some basic definitions here. We can use clinical definitions, we can use uh, definitions for someone like me to understand, like whatever you want to do. But what does it mean
Yeah.
to be diagnosed with autism and what does it mean to be neurodivergent?
Yeah, so neurodivergent, neurodiverse, people use it differently, but what they're typically referring to is what we call neurodevelopmental disorders. And I'll simplify that. So neurodevelopmental disorders are brain differences that you have from birth.
Mm.
Um, and they're things that you'll always have. So things like ADHD, autism, Down syndrome, learning disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. That's what is meant by neurodiverse, neurodivergent.
Mhm.
And before we get into it, I do want to just own that I am not on the spectrum, but I do have ADHD. And so, yeah, I don't offer a lived experience when we're talking about this stuff. It's professional and um so anyway.
So, if you have ADHD, you may be considered neurodiverse.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. And so you also, if you have autism one, two, or three, you're also considered neurodiverse.
Yep.
Okay. Tell us what, just in a general sense, what is autism one, two, and three?
Yeah. Um okay, well, I have a list cuz there's a lot
Oh,
and I've
okay.
tried to narrow it down and make it really bite-sized and digestible.
Yeah, I
Um
want to hear it.
Yeah, so and this is part of why it's hard to really get, fully familiar with autism is because it's so many things. And also a really famous phrase in the autism community is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism because there's so much diversity on the spectrum. But I'm going to give you the basic definitions of when I say that person is diagnosed with autism, this is concretely what I mean. Um, so the first thing is differences in social behaviors. This can be what we call reciprocity. So, back and forth conversations. These are examples. These are not true for everybody,
Sure.
but back and forth conversations might be hard. Um, Sharing emotion or feeling similar emotions, like if someone's telling you a sad story, someone with autism may or may not quickly feel sadness along with that person. So that's those are some examples of what we mean by reciprocity.
Mhm.
Another social difference is in nonverbal behavior. So some people with autism have unique tones or kind of ways that they're speaking. Sometimes it's a bit more flat, or there's just less diversity in the cadence and the tone.
Mhm.
Um, And then sometimes people can struggle to interpret other people's nonverbal signals. Um, Understanding nuances of social relationships. There's a lot of unwritten rules socially that autistic folks tend to miss, which is, when you think about it, missing unwritten rules is pretty valid.
So, the other thing I was thinking in that moment of perimenopause, or really any moment with change, sometimes there's more medical intervention, right? And more resources thrown at what's going on. So, it may be an
Yes.
opportunity that women are having while they're in there and they're having conversations with their doctors. It naturally
Mhm.
leads to other conversations about mental well being, cognitive overload, right? Cognitive overwhelm of what's going on in the world. So, maybe that's leading some women down a path of self exploration to then go get that diagnosis. So I can certainly see that. And I don't know if I'm making an incorrect assumption, but I think that's probably logical.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to talk a little bit about the prevalence of autism in our society because you made a comment earlier that in the past 5 years, we've really
Yeah.
been building towards this moment, right? Where it's
Yeah.
out there and people are talking about it. We've also had the convergence of Instagram and TikTok. And I think
Yes.
there are people out there who just like self-diagnose all sorts of stuff are also
Yeah.
self-diagnosing autism. And I want to talk a little bit about that because in many ways I think that's healthy, but in many ways I think that may not be the right path for a lot of individuals. So am I crazy in that people are using the internet to
No,
self-diagnose?
no, not at all. I
Okay.
see it all the time in my students. We talk about TikTok and social media all the time because, yes, it is kind of this front line of information for mental health and different diagnoses, and it's not typically great information. I do like it for like people sharing their experiences. I think getting on there and following autistic folks is a great way to get more education about what it's like to be autistic. But yeah, so social media, self-diagnosis, I think, it can be useful. It's actually really common for people to come to me for an autism assessment that have first started to relate to things posted about autism online. So that in that way, it can be a resource. The only thing I guess I would caution against, I think it's fine to resonate with any diagnosis, and you can learn about yourself as you ask those questions. But just to recognize that diagnoses and especially self-diagnoses aren't it's not a solution, it's a starting point, and it's helpful to think of it's I wanna get to the right starting point,
Yeah.
right? If it's autism, then we can connect you with the right resources. If it's ADHD, we can connect you to the right resources, but, yeah, self-diagnosis can be kind of like the first question on the journey toward diagnosis, but, yeah, for sure, there's some limitations to what you can access and if you're accessing the right things or not.
So
Yeah.
you're the type of psychology you just described where, people with autism are like part of a different culture reminds me of people who come from different countries, right? Different regions of the world, and they're
Mhm.
faced with American capitalism. And they're like, oh my goodness, how do I survive? Right. So, can you talk a
Yes.
little bit about those different intersections, especially around autism and how it maybe changes your approach to psychology?
Yeah. So, I was trained, in the area of multicultural psychology. I'm hearing that's an outdated term. Sometimes academics are a bit behind of like pop culture and anyway, but cross culture, there's other ways we could describe it, but it just essentially means that I look at systems when I'm looking to understand any individual human. And so that includes culture, that includes family system, that includes um, political climate, work environment, all of those things. And so when I look at what is the solution for somebody's struggles, I'm not first jumping to they're thinking incorrectly, they're acting incorrectly, so we're gonna reframe their thoughts and we're gonna coach them to behave differently.
Mhm.
I think bigger than that. And I think about, yeah, I think about capitalism. I think about American culture. I think about different systems of power and how those impact individuals, and talk with clients about how do we navigate systems that may or may not privilege who we are.